Looking for NFL football? Stop right here. You found your home for weekly NFL talk and fantasy football. Coming to you live from the BackupPunter.com. This is the Backup Punter Podcast. Now, here's your host, the man who thinks fullbacks win championships, Keegan Matheson.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. This is episode number 14. So thank you for joining. My name's Keegan Matheson. You can find me on Twitter at the Backup Punter. Check out the site at thebackupunter.com. And as always, subscribe on iTunes. You'll get this pumped right into your phone, your laptop each and every week leading up to kickoff. Now, we're almost 80 days away from kickoff, but we're entering kind of the dead zone in the NFL season. I think what's the slogan of NFL Network, where the season never sleeps or the season that never rests? Well, this is the time where that's a bit misleading. Over the next 4 weeks until we wait for training camp to arrive, minicamps and OTAs have finished up. This is when the players, the coaches all get away from the game. There's not going to be much news over the next month, but I'm going to stick with you right through it. We're going to go all the way through this league, division by division over the next month, wrap up everything that has happened, and look at everything that might happen. Now, this week, we are going to wrap up OTAs and minicamps. I'm going to go through each division, give you some storylines to look for that might affect your fantasy football team. Over the next month, we'll talk about this thing called real football, but this will be the last time we touch on fantasy football until all the players get back to training camp. So we'll go through all of that, touch on any news that comes up week to week. This week, Junior Galette, Warren Sapp, both suspected of domestic assault. There's always something good like that. We'll have some more news. There's a bit of a grainy video on Junior Galette, and it's going to be one of these things that gets dragged out, I feel, but not looking good for that guy. And with Warren Sapp, I hate to say it, but it's not surprising. As always, the Backup Punter Podcast is brought to you by the great people at DynastySportsEmpire.com Fantasy Sports. So whether you're into NFL, NBA, NHL, MLB, check out DynastySportsEmpire.com. They've got you covered. Right now, check them out on Twitter at DSE_football. Get into a startup Dynasty Fantasy Football League today. They start at $50. It's the most fun you can have playing fantasy football this season. Check them out. Now, it's been a week since we talked last. I'm recording this here on Monday, the 22nd. And within the past week, we have had the NBA champion crowned, which was the Golden State Warriors topping LeBron James, and the Cleveland Cavaliers. Of course, the day after, it comes out that LeBron James isn't happy with David Blatt. I've never felt really bad for a head coach. I almost feel like David Blatt is a child. You look at him like he's almost your son, and he's getting unfairly treated. Now, he hasn't always done the best job, but it's not his team. And it's awkward. It's a funny situation in Cleveland right now, but as always, LeBron needs somebody else to go under the bus for him. And that's not necessary. He had one of the most incredible series that you'll ever see in basketball. Stuff like this isn't necessary. Get on to next year. Then the NHL, we had the Stanley Cup awarded. The Chicago Blackhawks, they made it a dynasty. 3 out of 6 years. In the salary cap era, that's a dynasty. This isn't the 70s where you can win 8 in a row. They defeated the Tampa Bay Lightning in the Stanley Cup playoffs. Great series. Great matchup. But am I the only one who is getting a bit tired of hockey going into mid-June? I'm a hockey fan. I'm not the hardcore, die-hard, watch any team on any night hockey fan, but I follow the sport well enough, not as much as I used to. But it feels a bit strange to me. We're in the middle of June, you come home, you're hot, you have a sunburn, and there's another hockey game on that night. It drags on a bit. Maybe I'm alone in that, and I know that with the nature of the sport, you can't jam it all together, but it's a bit long. And then last night on Sunday, we had the U.S. Open. Now, I grew up in the golf world. Golf was my sport for the longest time in life. I decided to watch the last 9 holes of the U.S. Open last night. It's been a lot of years since I've tried to follow golf. My God, did I realize why it's been a lot of years since I've followed golf. They played on a goat field. It was the strangest golf course I've seen in my life. And on, I think it was the 17th hole. 17th hole it was. One of the players, he putt past the hole. So his putt rolled past the hole. Oh, good 15, 20 feet. Stopped, hit a hill, and rolled back past the hole another 20. Some of these things you were seeing, it was just, it would kill the common man. You or I would shoot 1,000 on that course. Jordan Spieth ended up winning. And he's the hot name in golf right now, but for someone like me who doesn't follow the sport, again, like hockey, I follow it, but not as a diehard fan anymore. I can't get into it without Tiger Woods. I can't get into it without him and Phil Mickelson battling. Without Sergio Garcia making a run, because everything is so vanilla now in golf. Jordan Spieth is incredible, but he's just so golf. Do you know what I mean? He's the clean-cut, neatly packaged, agreeable player. Not that Tiger Woods was a villain, but he had the edge to him. Sergio has the edge. Phil Mickelson was at least the fan favorite. He was the American common man's hero golfer. Where Tiger Woods was this model physique. Phil Mickelson, just kind of like the John Daly's of the world. He was the guy you could look at and say, you know what, he looks a little like me. Another thing I've always found hilarious about golf is how we cheer for everybody. Maybe golf needs a good villain. Maybe that's what they need. They need a bad guy. Something like Rocco Mediate, only good at golf. Yeah, we'll see. Maybe I'll make a run at tour and I'll be that guy. Shooter McGavin. Now, how about we talk about some football? OTAs and minicamps, they're all wrapped up now. Teams are in the point of the offseason where they go home, rest their bodies, and try to stay healthy. That's about it. Now, OTAs and minicamps, as I've said the last couple of weeks, they're not good for much, but they're good to tip us off to depth charts. Is this guy playing with the first team or the second team? Which quarterback is getting the most looks in the number one offense? Maybe teams are rolling out some new schemes. Stuff like that, we can take that and we can unpackage it. So I'm going to go through the AFC and the NFC today. Every division, I'll touch on 2 or 3 teams in some. I'll leave some teams out. Sorry about that. If you want me to touch on them, hit me up on Twitter at the Backup Punter. But I'll look at some stuff that's going to affect your fantasy football roster in 2015. Or stuff that might impact it. Stuff you should keep an eye on. Because for the next 4 weeks, we'll talk about real football. We'll be bold. We'll go against the grain and talk about real football that happens in the real world. It's dangerous, but we'll hold hands. We'll get through it together. Now, I'll start in the AFC, and I'll start in the South. This is not the strongest division in the world. Indianapolis Colts are likely going to run away with it. Houston Texans are on the rise, of course, but starting out in Tennessee, Marcus Mariota taking over there. One thing I've noticed, the reports coming out of Tennessee, is that Bishop Sankey is not a dead man. Bishop Sankey has quickly turned into kind of this Trent Richardson-esque joke amongst people. If you were to take Bishop Sankey in your fantasy draft, then you'd see down in the chat box, ha 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 ha, this guy's an idiot. Look at this guy just drafted Bishop Sankey. Well, Bishop Sankey's a starting running back in the NFL. Immediately, that makes him fantasy relevant. Do I love David Cobb? You bet your ass I love David Cobb. But he's not the starter yet. If you can draft Bishop Sankey around his ADP right now, which is quite low, and then grab David Cobb towards the back end of your draft, you're laughing. Because you've got a starting running back guaranteed on a team that's probably going to run the ball a lot. Now, Bishop Sankey was the first running back off the board in last year's draft, and he got some hype around him that he didn't really deserve. One of these things where, now, not to sound arrogant about this isn't what I mean, but people see him as the first running back off the board in the draft, and folks that don't really follow football too much, they say, well, I've got the best rookie running back. I'm going to take this guy. That's not necessarily how it works. It's really not how it works. But Bishop Sankey, the thing he needed to clear up was his footwork, his technique. He's got the athletic gifts you need. Absolutely. Athletically, he will never be hindered. That's always going to be there. But if he can put his footwork together, his vision, he could be something. I'm not making a comparison here whatsoever. But don't forget that Le'Veon Bell was not very good in his first year. He was a passable starting running back. His jump from year 1 to year 2 was incredible. It's one that nobody really expected, not to that extent. People, in retrospect now, they say, look, I told you so, but Nobody guessed it would be that extreme. Bishop Sankey's not going to do that, but he could do something. Don't sleep on Bishop Sankey, because the reports out of Tennessee are that he is improving the footwork, which is really important for him. Looking around the division, you see the Houston Texans. Brian Hoyer is reportedly getting a little more of a look at the first-string quarterback than Ryan Mallett is. That doesn't impact your QB position, because if you're drafting Brian Hoyer or Ryan Mallett, unless you're in a 32-team league, which doesn't exist, then I'm not sure what you're doing. Those guys aren't draftable. What I worry about here is DeAndre Hopkins, the wide receiver, who is very quietly a stud receiver in fantasy. I think he's got a great shot at going for that 1,200 yards, maybe 8 touchdown mark this year. Very valuable receiver. If you've never seen DeAndre Hopkins' hands, Google it. He has the biggest hands of any living thing on earth. Of any living thing. Large animals included. It's incredible. My worry with him is that Brian Hoyer might be someone who's a little more inclined to use the tight ends, to use Cecil Shorts out of the slot, maybe Jalen Strong if he's back. DeAndre Hopkins is going to get number one work regardless. But with Ryan Mallett, I think he could open up that downfield game, because Hopkins could have a great deep game if Ryan Mallett gets in. But then with Mallett, can he keep up the short passes enough to open up the deep game? If Houston could combine Brian Hoyer and Ryan Mallett, they'd have a real shot at this division. It's sort of a pick your poison with those two. But keep an eye on that, because DeAndre Hopkins is a guy that I love. And then we look at the Jacksonville Jaguars. Allen Robinson, their second-round pick from last year. Reports are saying he's making a very strong run at being their number one wide receiver, it's wide open down there. Justin Blackmon, it's just not looking good for him. He's not going to be back this year. Marquise Lee, that's a receiver I love, but he's probably a better 2-3 complimentary guy. Allen Robinson led the Big Ten in receiving his last 2 years in college. He's a tall receiver. He can push that 40 inches in the vertical. And I've read a lot of articles about Gus Bradley just loving this guy's fire. He has the my ball mentality, which means that when he jumps up to get a ball, he's not trying to get the ball. He's saying, this is my football. Get the hell out of here. I'm going to grab this. That's valuable, especially with Blake Bortles, who the potential's there, but he hasn't shown it enough yet. He's got to take a big jump. Let's move to the AFC East. The New England Patriots, a big question I've heard a lot about on podcasts, on radio lately, is who's going to be their receiving back? LeGarrette Blount is probably going to be the lead back, obviously, but who's going to come in and be that receiving back that Tom Brady really leans on? The answer is, the only answer we have is a guess. And I have no idea who it's going to be. That's not the answer you're looking for, but what it means is that you should stay away from it, I think. There's a lot of people saying James White, maybe Tavares Cadet. Well, this is a situation where you should let somebody else make the mistake, I think, because the risk is not worth the reward here. What I would suggest is if a lot of these options do go undrafted in your league, which they should, the cadets of the world should probably go undrafted, wait to see what happens in Week 1 and Week 2. Remember that LeGarrette Blount's suspended for Week 1? Well, Week 1 might not be your best gauge, but Week 2, when LeGarrette Blount's back, see who's in there on those passing downs. But don't forget that just because a player rushes for 200 yards one week, that doesn't even mean he's going to see the field next week with Bill Belichick. I've talked about the Patriots' backfield a lot. Let someone else have that headache. The Miami Dolphins, a lot of chatter out of Miami now about Davante Parker. Now, he was really grabbing some headlines, burning Brent Grimes in OTAs, making the veteran stud look foolish. But now he's had a minor procedure. It was surgery, but I hesitate to use that word because it makes it sound like he got something serious. It was a little procedure to fix a screw in his foot that dates back to a prior injury. Now, initially people feared that he would have to start the season on the physically unable to play list, that maybe he'd really start slow. And he started to drop down boards a lot. Well, I'm not ready to do that quite yet. This is a situation where people don't value Davante Parker because he was not Amari Cooper and he was not Kevin White. The receiver group is pretty crowded in Miami. I'll give you that. But if you are drafting a long-term receiver in a keeper league, Dynasty League, you've got to love Davante Parker because the cream is going to rise to the top. And most importantly, outside of Jordan Cameron, I see Davante Parker being the number one red zone target. So even if he gets capped at that 800-yard region, I think he could have 6-8 touchdowns to make him relevant in the back end of fantasy. And I especially think he's going to ramp up in the final 6 weeks of the season, which for you means playoff time. And that's big. Then we look at the Buffalo Bills. Tyrod Taylor, my boy. I wrote about Tyrod Taylor at the backuppunter.com. Check that out a few weeks ago. About how I think that he should at least have a shot at being the starting quarterback in Buffalo. And so far, it seems that he has. He and Matt Castle are reportedly neck to neck in Buffalo. And I think Rex Ryan is just the type of coach that Tyrod Taylor needs. What's that mean for you? Well, that means that they are going to run the ball a hell of a lot more than they already were going to. LaShawn McCoy is obviously going to get his touches. But one guy that you shouldn't forget about is Fred Jackson. Now, Fred Jackson's 100 years old. Absolutely. But I think there's still room for him to get 150 touches this season. He could certainly still touch the football 8-10 times a game. That's not what you're looking for as a starter or even as a flex. But towards the bottom of your bench, keep an eye on Fred Jackson. A lot of people just assume the guy's retired by now, but don't forget about him. And he's one of the ultimate good guys in the NFL. So if you're one of those kind of a hippie like me who thinks that locker room chemistry is important on your fake fantasy team, get yourself some Fred Jackson. Look at the AFC North. Cincinnati Bengals. I'm watching Tyler Eifert, the tight end. Going into his third season, he only played one game last year due to an injury, but this guy's 6'6", athletic. Andy Dalton does not have a deep ball. It's going to hurt A.J. Green. It's going to help Tyler Eifert. They're going to run the football hard with Jeremy Hill. And when that defense draws in, those linebackers and extra safety comes into the box, Tyler Eifert over the top. That's going to be a weapon. I think he's going to be a big red zone weapon. Baltimore Ravens. Can Justin Forsett excel as a receiver with Mark Trestman? Now, the narrative here seems to be that Justin Forsett's going to catch 1,000 footballs with Mark Trestman. Well, he's going to catch more than he would have normally. But is Lorenzo Taliaferro going to get in there a little bit? I think he just might. Baltimore has a great rookie running back who's an excellent receiver, too. What about Brashad Perryman? Is he for real? Is he going to fill in that Torrey Smith-type role where he runs 1,000 deep routes, catches 5 of them, and puts up some inconsistent numbers? I think that's about it. I'm not touching Brashad Perryman in year one. There's not a lot of competition for him, but he's going to put up so many 0 weeks that it's going to make the 20-point weeks a little difficult to stomach. And then the Cleveland Browns, who I love, and even if you don't love them, you secretly do. You secretly love the Cleveland Browns. Johnny Manziel, Josh McCown, has got to be probably the most interesting storyline entering training camp in a month, I think. And in my opinion, it's going to come down to how safe the coaching staff feels with their jobs. Let me explain this. The coaching staff was given Josh McCown. So if the coaching staff decides to go with McCown and they lose, they can say, well, ownership, GM, we rode the horse you gave us, and we came up short. And that keeps them pretty safe in their jobs, because people like to have jobs, believe it or not. If the coaching staff wants to take a risk going with Johnny Manziel, that's dangerous. Because if they take that risk by themselves, then to the face of ownership, to the face of the GM, that's, hey, you gave me a veteran, but I went ahead and ignored that, and I went with the hot, flashy rookie. If the coaching staff fails in that situation, then it's all on them. Entirely on them. And that's when people start to lose jobs. So keep an eye on that. And when I do preview the Cleveland Browns sometime over the next few weeks, I'm really going to dig into this backfield. Really dig into it. Terrence West is there. I don't think he's going to be the lead guy. Isaiah Crowell, who I absolutely love. If you listen to this podcast, you know I love Isaiah Crowell. Undrafted rookie last year. Did not have undrafted talent. It was more off-field stuff that kept him undrafted. And now Duke Johnson out of Miami, who is an absolute spark plug. Home run threat. How's that going to shake out fantasy-wise? Is it going to be the dreaded timeshare that you never guess right on? There's a chance. This is something that we need training camp to decide, so I'm not going to guess on it now, just by seeing OTAs, minicamps, and the dress rehearsal. But that's a storyline, and just this is a team to watch, fantasy football-wise, through training camp. And now we look at the AFC West. San Diego Chargers. One thing I'm noticing out of San Diego over the past week, everything I'm reading, everything I'm listening to, is that their offensive line is really looking strong. They've signed Orlando Franklin, giving them one of the larger group of humans along the offensive line that you'll find in the NFL. And there's some quiet excitement. Because you'll remember Melvin Gordon at Wisconsin. Wisconsin running backs are notorious for running behind great college lines and then getting to the NFL and struggling with weaker lines. Well, this might be giving Melvin Gordon what he needs. He's a home run hitter and he likes to bounce it outside. Well, instead of trying to convert him to an inside runner, maybe you let the boy be himself. Let him do that. So that's exciting. And maybe that has a trickle-down effect. Let Keenan Allen free up a little bit more. I think he's finally ready to go after that 1,200-yard, 6 or 8 touchdown mark. Really have a quiet breakout because he has all the talent in the world, but he could not produce the big play last year. It was catch, 2 steps, tackle. Catch, fall down. So I'm hoping that offensive line has a trickle-down effect. It might give some fantasy relevance to a Danny Woodhead, but not enough to lose any sleep over. Look at the Oakland Raiders. Amari Cooper, everything coming out of camp is great right now, but I continue to worry. Is Amari Cooper being the clear number one a good thing for his fantasy potential? You've got Rod Streeter down there, Michael Crabtree. You've got the tight ends who are good for some garbage catches, short yardage work. But Amari Cooper, if he's getting double covered, I don't know how that's going to work out for him. So the thing to watch, if you're someone eyeing Amari Cooper, just accept right now that Amari Cooper's going to be fine. Don't worry about that. What you need to watch is Rod Streeter. Rod Streeter is the most important person to Amari Cooper's fantasy production. He's more important to Amari Cooper than Amari Cooper is. I think he's got the talent to do it, too. So Oakland could be getting lucky here if they get both of those guys rolling. And then the Kansas City Chiefs. One move that I really love. I'm not sure if it will pay any fantasy dividends, but they've moved DeAnthony Thomas to wide receiver from running back. This guy's 5'8". He's listed about 185 pounds. That's with full pockets, soaking wet, I think. But if Andy Reid can turn him into kind of a jitterbug slot option, maybe run some gadget plays, I think he could be really interesting. If the Chiefs run into injuries, you might look at him towards the bottom of your roster. So that's the AFC, Southeast, North, and West. We'll take a quick break here on the Backup Punter Podcast. When we come back, we will talk about the ever-mighty NFC before we wrap up. Stick with me. So let's turn our eyes to the NFC, and we're going to start in the NFC South. Just like we started with Marcus Mariota on the AFC side, we're going to start with Jameis Winston on the NFC side. What I'm watching in Tampa Bay, it's not Jameis Winston. I think Mike Evans will be fine. Vincent Jackson will do his 1,000 yards flat with no yards after the catch thing again. I'm watching Doug Martin. Doug Martin, just a couple of years ago, was a fantasy stud. An absolute monster who looked like he was going to be a monster for 6 more years. Well, now he's dealing with Charles Sims. Now, Charles Sims is the guy that the current regime brought in, so it's that battle between the old guard and the new people. Who do the coaching staff like? Right now, Doug Martin is running with the first-team offense, which is really encouraging. I think he is a much better runner than Charles Sims. Absolutely. Charles Sims may offer more in the receiving game. He could see some third down work. But Doug Martin's reportedly slimmed down a little bit, and I think that'll be big for him. That extra agility just to burst through a hole, absolutely massive. Dirk Cutter, the new offensive coordinator, he likes him. He's in a contract year, so there's motivation galore. Doug Martin might end up being fantasy relevant. If he falls to a point where he's a little bit below his ADP for me, I'm not going to be afraid to take a risk on him. Then over in Atlanta, Roddy White, he's still relevant. I went on this rant last week, so I'll spare you this week. Everything I read out of Atlanta is that Roddy White is still Roddy White. He's going to put up 1,000 yards this year. He's not going to have much trouble doing it. And Julio Jones, of course, is going to be one of the top receivers in this league. Now, Julio Jones is entering a contract situation, but I really love how he's handled it. He said, listen, me addressing that right now, me focusing on my contract right now is selfish. It's not fair to my teammates, so I'm not going to talk about my contract. I'm just going to play. All of that's going to work out. Now, behind the scenes, it could be different, but public perception, that's how you handle a contract situation. So I think you're going to have, obviously one very, very good fantasy option, but if you can get Roddy White as your wide receiver 3, I think you're laughing. And that's going to keep the spot safe for you. Wide receiver 3 is a spot that you see flip around a lot in your roster through the year with waiver wire guys. Well, if you can solidify your third receiver spot, then that lets you focus elsewhere, and I think that's very valuable. Now, down the Carolina Panthers, I had a Twitter question this week from friend of the show, Ryan Andrews. He tweeted in and said that there's been some reports, which there have been, that the Carolina Panthers star receiver Kelvin Benjamin showed up a little heavy to OTAs, to minicamps. That's always an issue. Whenever you think heavy, you think Jamarcus Russell, which, there's no relation here at all. But when pro athletes show up a bit heavy, it worries me. If I show up a bit heavy for my job, well, you know what? There was a sale on pizza this weekend. Don't blame me. But if a pro athlete shows up heavy, where part of their job is being in good shape, it's a little worrying. Now, if a guy like Randall Cobb or Mike Wallace shows up 5 pounds over, no problem. They're naturally quick. They have small bodies. That's not a problem. Kelvin Benjamin's a very big guy. Is this going to turn into a chronic weight issue? Is this going to be every couple of years we hear about him ballooning up a little bit because he is so large? There's a lot of room on that body to pack some extra pounds. He has many donut storage options on that frame. And he's not a guy that can really afford to lose agility. Where a guy like Randall Cobb, Mike Wallace... Did I say Mike Wallace earlier? I meant Antonio Brown. That's terrible. No. Antonio Brown. This is Amateur Hour with the Backup Punter Podcast. But a guy like Cobb or Antonio Brown, they can afford to lose a little agility because they'll pop it right back, and they've got so much of it. When Kelvin Benjamin loses that burst, then there's no way he's going to get behind defenders. There's no way he's going to come out of a slant route and have the advantage. You saw that happen to Big Mike Williams. Big Mike Williams, BMW, one of the great receivers in my eyes, even though he was, he's pretty bad. But that's what he ran into. Weight problems as a big receiver. Not everybody's Calvin Johnson. Those big receivers run into trouble, and if they lose that first step, then all they have to rely on is size. And just size is not enough. There's 100 guys who are 6'4", 230 pounds that are not making it in the NFL. There's 1 million guys that have that size. You've got to have the athleticism to go along with the frame. So, am I worried about Kelvin Benjamin? No, because he has a month to lose what's probably just 10 pounds, which you or I could do. So I'd imagine somebody in a professional sports organization with a training staff and doctors can do it. I think he's going to be okay. But it gives me that little 1% twinge of nerves. I mean, keep an eye on that guy. Then down in New Orleans, I'm interested in that running back situation. C.J. Spiller, Mark Ingram, they could both easily be fantasy relevant. Now, C.J. Spiller is going to be that receiving back. Don't be surprised if you see him out of the slot. He's going to catch a lot of footballs. Mark Ingram, He's going to be the primary runner, and he's also going to get the goal line carries. Do not forget about the goal line carries, especially without Jimmy Graham in town. There are a lot of touchdowns available in New Orleans. A lot of touchdowns. Looking at the NFC East, in Dallas, it's all about Dez Bryant's contract situation. Now, there's the rumblings that he'd hold out the first game, and you know what? I think he would balk at the opportunity to cough up $1 million. I don't think he's going to miss any time. And what I look to here is 1993. Emmitt Smith held out in 1993. Jerry Jones was there then, too. He's been there for 400 years. Emmitt Smith held out. The Cowboys went 0-2 to start the season. And Jerry Jones went, well, I messed up, and he paid the guy. Say what you will about Jerry Jones, but more than any owner in the league, I feel like he does take care of his guys. And he's not trying to nickel and dime them. He's not trying to undermine his own players. Jerry Jones does make some hilarious personnel decisions, but I feel, relatively speaking, that he's a good guy to his players. And especially Dez Bryant. Dez Bryant has almost been a pet project to Jerry Jones. It's his adopted player who he's tried to keep right on and off the field, and so far, so good, I think. So I expect Dez Bryant to be on the field week 1 and be a top 5 fantasy receiver without issue. New York Giants, let's look at their running backs. Rashad Jennings, Andre Williams, Shane Vereen. What's that fantasy split going to be looking like? Is it going to be like Earth, Wind, and Fire back in the Super Bowl days? That was beautiful to watch. Well, I think it's going to be so watered down that you'll be disappointed with any of those options there. Now, Rashad Jennings, of course, is going to be the lead guy. Andre Williams was disappointing last year. Maybe he'll take a second-year jump. I'm very interested in Shane Vereen, though, who's left the Patriots for New York. Victor Cruz, I don't know if he's going to come back early, what shape he's going to be in. Very nervous he's not going to be even at 90%. So Eli Manning is going to need some options to complement Odell Beckham Jr. If Odell Beckham Jr. is looking for compliments, he could always look in the mirror, I suppose. But that's another issue for another day. Shane Vereen, I think, could easily catch well over 50 footballs for the New York Giants. He's going to have some fantasy relevance, so I'd be watching him very closely the first few weeks, and definitely watch the Giants throughout training camp. See what those carries are being split up as. Because these are 3 running backs who could all theoretically start for a team. They're not elite starters, but they're all good running backs. This is a nice group right here. Then we look at the Philadelphia Eagles. Very quietly, Sam Bradford is starting to cause some worries with his health. He's still not back in 11-on-11. The Eagles are giving us the line right now that, well, he just needs a little more time to get back from this injury. He'll get right into it in training camp. But does that put Sam Bradford a little bit behind the 8 ball? Especially with this offense, which is very unique. This isn't just a normal offense that you pick up in a day. It's complex. It's fast. No huddle. Quickly moving. So what if Mark Sanchez does have to step in and be the starter? Well, I don't think that's much of an issue for you. They're still going to run DeMarco Murray hard. Don't forget about Ryan Matthews, who could see some touches. Darren Sproles will be Darren Sproles. But I think that Jordan Matthews is still going to have a fine season. As I've said before, I think he's going to cap around being that 1,100-yard guy. I don't think he'll be that massive number 1 with the 1,400 yards and 10 scores. But I don't like Riley Cooper. You can decide for yourself whether or not I'm talking about Riley Cooper, the person or player. I do like Zach Ertz a lot. I think he's going to be the big producer in this offense, and that's regardless of quarterback. So I wouldn't let Bradford or Sanchez worry me too much, because we're not comparing Aaron Rodgers and Sam Bradford or Peyton Manning and Mark Sanchez here. Bradford and Sanchez, you're comparing a dozen of one and 12 of the other. It's tight. Speaking of Aaron Rodgers, let's jump into the NFC North here, the second last division we have before I let you go. This is a very intriguing situation in Green Bay. Davante Adams, second-year wide receiver who the Packers selected in the second round last year, really flashed down the stretch. especially against the Dallas Cowboys, who he made look silly. But he's caught behind Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb. It's been a long time since a team had 3 receivers who were fantasy relevant. Maybe you look back to the Arizona Cardinals years ago when they had Anquan Bolden, Larry Fitzgerald, and Steve Breston, when all 3 went for 1,000 yards. But it's very rare for you to see that third receiver be fantasy relevant. Davante Adams is going to get so hyped that he's going to be well overdrafted. He's going to get drafted well above where he should. But if Jordy Nelson or Randall Cobb are injured, which happens, Davante Adams becomes one of the most intriguing players in all of fantasy football. He's got the ability to fill in as a starter. In a starting role, he could easily go over 1,000 yards. He has the talent. Mike McCarthy named him the MVP of OTAs. Aaron Rodgers hyped him up as having superstar talent. This is a guy that if you draft him, you're going to need to draft him high, and you're looking at a 50-50 shot of what you're getting. But thankfully, the floor is quite nice. Even at his floor, you're going to get some good weeks from him. Then over in Minnesota with the Vikings. Adrian Peterson's back, we know that. What impact does that have? One place I'm looking is Kyle Rudolph, the tight end. The box is going to be drawn in. 8-man box. Kyle Rudolph is going to work. Now, Mike Wallace, who we should correctly talk about this time, Mike Wallace is going to have room to work over the top, too. Now, will his ego get in the way? Probably. But as long as he can make those big plays for Teddy Bridgewater, that's going to be extremely important. As a fantasy football play, he's going to be one of those guys that gives you a stat line from week 1 to 4 of 1 point, 1 point, 28 points, 6 points. Are you going to pick that 28-point week to bench him? Probably. That's how fantasy football works. But he's more relevant in Minnesota right now than I think he would have been in Miami. A lot of people are down on Mike Wallace, so you might actually get him at a decent ADP. And then in Detroit, Amir Abdullah is neck and neck with Joique Bell, according to a lot of reports from the Detroit beat writers. Amir Abdullah could be a great receiving back. The issue with him, little bitty hands, a lot of fumbles in college. I think that's something he can absolutely fix with technique. That's no problem. But he is a significantly more dynamic running back than Joique Bell. Joique Bell, he's a thumper. But if memory serves, correct me if I'm wrong, but if memory serves here, Detroit has only had one 1,000-yard rusher in the past decade. And I think that guy, Reggie Bush, only went over 1,000 by a few yards. This team needs a legitimate running back. And it's not going to be one or the other. Joique Bell and Amir Abdullah, that's a great combination. But I think Amir Abdullah really could take the number 1 snaps. And if he can, and if you can get him before his ADP shoots up, you are laughing. And let's finish up with the NFC West. The Seattle Seahawks. Russell Wilson, Marshawn Lynch, Jimmy Graham, fantastic fantasy options. What about the wide receivers? Are there any wide receivers here that you are looking at with any fantasy value? Baldwin, Curse, Tyler Lockett. It could be that you're in a league where none of these Seattle Seahawks receivers are rostered. If I had my shot, I might take a last-round pick on Doug Baldwin. Ty Lockett, you all know I love him. I'd take a 14th, 15th rounder flyer on him. Because what if a Marshawn Lynch or Jimmy Graham gets hurt? They're forced to throw the ball. But these guys, you're not going to get that 1,000-yard, 10-touchdown receiver. So unless you are really confident you know something the rest of us don't, in which case, go for it. Make your own board. Go for it. That's great. But unless that's the case, kind of like the New England Patriots backfield, this is a situation where I'm probably just going to stay away. It might bite me, but I'd rather someone else take the risk. The St. Louis Rams, fantasy assassin Tavon Austin is reportedly having a very good offseason. Now take that with 1,000 grains of salt, because everybody's having a reportedly great offseason. I'm sure if you look hard enough, you'll find that I am having a great offseason for some team without even knowing it. I'm in the best shape of my life. Now Frank Cignetti, the new offensive coordinator, he's a little more imaginative. He could have maybe cracked in on Tavon Austin. For Tavon Austin, it's all mental. Figuring out the offense, running routes. It's nothing to do with athleticism. He's one of the more talented athletic specimens in the league. That's no problem. It's all about the brain. So keep an eye on him. Don't draft the guy. Please don't draft Tavon Austin. But keep an eye on him. Because the door's wide open in St. Louis. Wide open for a receiver to step up. And then last, and probably least, San Francisco 49ers. They've got problems all over the board. One newcomer to their team is Torrey Smith. Now, I mentioned Anquan Bolden, Vernon Davis last week, both of whom I'm high on. Higher on than most, I guess, would be the correct way to say it. What about Torrey Smith? Is he going to do what he did last year? Well, he's not going to catch those touchdowns. And I'm nervous that Torrey Smith is going to be one of the more disappointing players in fantasy this year. I'm not going to touch him anywhere near his ADP. He'd have to fall well below his ADP for me to go after Torrey Smith. Let someone else make that mistake, because, he's one of these recognizable names. In every one of your fantasy leagues, there's going to be a few of your friends who are not as into football as you are, and they'll see Torrey Smith and see a name they recognize and say, well, hell yeah, guys, I'm going to take him. It's that person that drafts Larry Fitzgerald really high. Some idiot, like me. But Torrey Smith it's a phenomenon that I'll keep coming back to over the next 2 months. His name is more valuable than his production. You can find 20, 30 guys around Torrey Smith's value who aren't big names, who your fringe NFL fan buddy doesn't really know about, but they're going to give you the same production, if not better. So I'm going to stay away from him. So that's been our look through the AFC and NFC after OTAs and minicamps. So as you can tell, a lot of this is still in the hypothetical mode. This is setting the stage for training camp, and it's going to be a very exciting training camp across the league. Because with the newfound impact of rookies, they have the opportunity to play from day one. They have the opportunity to jump over a starting veteran and make a fantasy impact right away. The good thing about that is if you're staying on top of it, then you're going to have a great draft. You're going to win your league because you know who's going to be the starter. The bad part about it, though, is that there's so much competition in the NFL right now, especially at wide receiver and tight end. There's so much competition that there's going to be some timeshares. And that is a curse in fantasy football. So as always, you can find this podcast and the 13 that came before it on iTunes. So subscribe to the Backup Punter Podcast on iTunes. You'll get the show right to your phone, to your laptop every week. And that also means you'll get the show a couple hours before I get it up on the website, on backuppunter.com. And I also have a YouTube channel now. Search the Backup Punter on YouTube. Just because that's a lot easier for some people who don't use iTunes, don't use a podcatcher. For those of you who are on Android or prefer to use Stitcher, you can also find it there on Stitcher, so subscribe there as well. And for next week's show, we're going to start going through the divisions one at a time. I think each week for the next 4 weeks, I'll take 2. So next week, we might go through the AFC North, AFC South. If you have any questions about your team, about any team, send them in over the next few weeks. I'll save them up for when we do get to your team. Are you looking at a wide receiver battle? Are you wondering what it means that your team has changed formation? There's no such thing as a bad question here at the Backup Punter Podcast, so send them in, include your name, where you're from. I'll be sure to mention it on the show. So keep an eye on the backuppunter.com throughout the week. If there's any big news, you will see it there. So this is Keegan Matheson signing off now, episode number 14. As always, I hope that every punt you make in life stops on the 1-yard line. Let's talk next week.